The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled into their seats, their curiosity hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't a typical trial that had drawn the crowd today. It was something far more personal, yet undeniably extraordinary. At the center of the room sat Sergeant Nathan Carter, a man who had seen too much but spoken too little. He was in his late 30s, but his weathered face and deep-set eyes told a story of someone who had aged decades in the span of a few years. The rigid lines of his military uniform and the gleam of medals on his chest clashed with the wheelchair he sat in, a jarring juxtaposition that spoke volumes without a single word. Beside him sat Thor, a German shepherd with an aura of calm authority. To the untrained eye, Thor might have looked like any other service dog. But Nathan knew better. Thor was no ordinary canine. He was a soldier in his own right, trained to detect danger, save lives, and protect without hesitation. To Nathan, Thor wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, a brother in arms, and the only constant in a world that had turned upside down. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the judge entered, a stern figure who seemed to carry the weight of the decision he was about to make. Everyone knew why they were there. The military had deemed Thor government property, essential for a new mission. But to Nathan, this wasn't just bureaucracy. It was betrayal. The judge's voice broke the silence. Sergeant Carter, this hearing will determine whether Thor remains with you or is reassigned. You have the opportunity to address the court. Nathan's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on Thor's leash. He had prepared a speech, rehearsed it in the sleepless hours of the night. But now, facing the packed courtroom and the gravity of the moment, words felt inadequate. Taking a deep breath, he looked at Thor, who met his gaze with unwavering loyalty. As if to say, "You've got this." He turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "Thor isn't just a military asset. He's my partner, my protector, my family. On the battlefield, he didn't just save my life. He gave me a reason to come back. And when I came home, when the world didn't feel real anymore, he was the one who kept me grounded." A hushed silence fell over the room. Even those who had come out of sheer curiosity found themselves leaning forward, caught in the sincerity of Nathan's words. But before the judge could respond, Thor's ears perked up. He shifted in place, his body language instantly changing from calm to alert. A low growl rumbled from his chest, quiet but enough to send a ripple of unease through the room. Nathan's brow furrowed. He knew this behavior. Thor was never wrong. "Thor," Nathan whispered, gripping the leash tighter. But the dog's attention was fixed elsewhere, on the far end of the courtroom, where the heavy wooden doors stood closed. The judge, visibly perturbed, adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Carter, please control your dog." Nathan's heart raced. "Thor isn't reacting for no reason, Your Honor," he said, his voice sharper now. "He's trained to detect threats." The tension in the room thickened. Spectators exchanged nervous glances, and the bailiffs subtly shifted their positions, hands resting near their holsters. Thor's growl grew louder, his body rigid, as he locked onto something Nathan couldn't see. "Is there a problem?" the judge asked, his voice laced with both authority and concern. Nathan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Thor lunged forward, yanking the leash out of his hands. Gasps erupted from the crowd as Thor barked sharply, moving toward the judge's bench with a precision that was anything but random. The sound of claws scraping against the polished floor echoed in the room, cutting through the rising murmurs. Nathan's chest tightened. He wheeled himself forward, his voice rising above the chaos. "He's trying to tell us something." But what? What could Thor sense that no one else could? The room fell into a tense silence, all eyes on Thor as his barks turned into a deep, guttural growl. Whatever it wasn't just a hunch. It was a warning, and everyone could feel it. The judge cleared his throat, his gavel clutched tightly in his hand, though he hadn't used it yet. His eyes shifted uneasily between Nathan and Thor, the dog whose barks now echoed in the silent courtroom. The calm, orderly atmosphere had shattered, replaced with a tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. Nathan's thoughts raced. This wasn't how today was supposed to go. He'd come prepared to plead his case, to convince the court that Thor deserved to stay with him, not to cause a scene. But now, all eyes were on Thor, who stood alert in front of the judge's bench, his body taut, his growls low and menacing. Thor wasn't just acting on instinct. Nathan knew his partner well enough to recognize the signs. This wasn't fear or confusion. Thor had detected something, a threat no one else in the room could see or feel. And if there was one thing Nathan trusted more than his own instincts, it was Thor's. "Nathan," a voice called softly from the front row. It was Captain Laura Hayes, Nathan's former commanding officer and one of the few people who had stood by him after his injury. She was here to support his case, but now her face was pale, her expression one of quiet alarm. "What's going on? Why is Thor acting like this?" Nathan shook his head. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not good." The judge finally spoke, his voice sharp but not entirely steady. "Mr. Carter, control your dog, or I'll have no choice but to—" "Your Honor," Nathan interrupted, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm asking you to trust me. Thor isn't misbehaving, he's warning us. He only acts like this when there's danger." The words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. Some in the crowd shifted nervously in their seats, while others whispered to each other, their curiosity now tinged with fear. The bailiffs exchanged uncertain glances, their hands instinctively moving closer to their holstered weapons. Nathan's mind flickered back to the battlefield, to moments when Thor's warnings had saved lives. He remembered the time Thor had frozen mid-patrol, his body rigid, growling at an empty stretch of dirt road. Moments later, the team discovered a hidden explosive buried beneath the surface. Another time, Thor had lunged at an enemy combatant hiding in the shadows, taking the man down before he could ambush the squad. Thor's instincts were never wrong. Not once. And now here in this courtroom, Thor was giving the same signal: danger. Nathan wheeled himself closer, his eyes fixed on Thor. "Thor," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "What is it, buddy? What do you see?" Thor's gaze didn't waver. His ears were pinned back, his body low, and his growls deepened. He was locked onto something or someone. The judge glanced nervously toward the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the courtroom. "Bailiffs," he said, his voice rising. "Check the hallway." Two of the officers nodded and moved cautiously toward the doors. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, rested his hand on the handle, while the other unholstered his flashlight. The crowd watched in silence, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself might shatter. "Let's not overreact," the larger bailiff said, his voice steady but low. "It's probably nothing." But even as he spoke, his steps were hesitant, his movements deliberate. He wasn't convinced, and neither was anyone else. Nathan's hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair as he watched the scene unfold. Thor had gone silent now, but his body remained coiled, every muscle taut. His focus was unbreakable, his entire being fixed on the door. The bailiff slowly turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit hallway beyond. It appeared empty, the polished floor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But the silence was wrong. Too heavy, too unnatural. The air felt charged, like the moments before a storm. "I don't see anything," the bailiff called back, though his voice carried a hint of unease. He took a step into the hallway, shining his flashlight down the corridor. "It's just—" The metallic clang of something hitting the floor echoed from the darkness, cutting him off mid-sentence. The sound was sharp and deliberate, like a warning. The bailiff froze, his flashlight beam jerking slightly as he adjusted his grip. "What was that?" someone whispered from the back of the courtroom. Thor erupted into barking again, his body lunging forward as if he could force himself through the judge's bench to confront the unseen threat. Nathan's heart pounded as he gripped the leash tightly, his voice rising above the growing murmurs. "Get back," he shouted to the bailiff. "Whatever it is, it's not safe." The judge stood abruptly, his gavel clattering onto the bench. "Everyone remain calm," he demanded, though his voice betrayed his own unease. The bailiff glanced back, his face pale. "There's something here," he said hesitantly. His partner, still standing at the doorway, nodded in silent agreement. The crowd shifted nervously, fear beginning to ripple through the room like a current. And then, without warning, the lights flickered once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. Gasps and muffled screams erupted from the crowd, chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled in confusion. Nathan's pulse thundered in his ears as he reached for Thor, whose presence was the only anchor in the chaos. In the pitch-black silence, a single sound rang out, a deliberate, heavy footstep. The courtroom plunged into darkness, save for the erratic flashes of light spilling in from the hallway beyond. Panic surged like a tidal wave. Chairs screeched as people scrambled to their feet, voices clashing in a chaotic symphony of confusion and fear. Somewhere in the crowd, someone shouted, "What's going on?" Nathan tightened his grip on Thor's leash, the dog's body still rigid and bristling with tension. Thor growled low, a sound so primal it made the hair on the back of Nathan's neck stand on end. He wasn't just reacting, he was ready. And that made Nathan's pulse quicken with dread. "Thor, stay," Nathan whispered, his voice trembling but steady enough to reach the dog. The leash felt like the only thing tethering Nathan to any sense of control as the chaos spiraled around him. From the hallway came another heavy footstep, deliberate and measured, each one a stark reminder that the darkness wasn't empty. The crowd fell silent, breaths held in collective terror, as if the entire room knew they were being watched. "Bailiffs," the judge shouted, his authoritative tone cracking under the strain of fear. "What's out there?" No response. The two officers who had ventured into the hallway were now eerily quiet. A flashlight rolled into the doorway, its beam flickering across the polished floor like a weak heartbeat. Nathan's gut churned. This wasn't normal. "I'm going out there," said the smaller bailiff by the bench, his voice shaky as he gripped his flashlight tighter and unholstered his sidearm. He glanced at Nathan, his pale face betraying the courage he was trying to muster. "Stay back." Nathan shook his head. "Don't. Whatever's out there, it's not playing games." The bailiff hesitated, his grip tightening on his weapon. He wasn't convinced, but Thor's growls gave him pause. This wasn't a dog reacting to shadows. Thor was honed, trained to spot threats that most people couldn't comprehend. And yet, the bailiff stepped forward. "Wait," Nathan called, his voice sharp. "You're walking into something blind." The bailiff ignored him, pushing the door open wider. The dim hallway seemed to swallow the light, but it revealed enough. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible in the faint glow of a dying bulb. It was the stranger. Nathan recognized him immediately. The man who had walked into the courtroom so calmly, who had held up a simple key as if it were a trophy. Now he stood motionless, his face obscured by shadows, his posture unnervingly relaxed despite the chaos he'd caused. "What do you want?" the bailiff shouted, his weapon raised, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The man took a single step forward, his boots clicking ominously against the tiled floor. "I told you," the man said, his voice calm yet chilling, as though he were discussing the weather. "I'm here for the dog." Nathan's stomach dropped. Thor barked furiously, lunging against the leash, his claws scraping the floor in protest. The stranger's words carried an unsettling weight, a confidence that suggested he wasn't asking, he was taking. The bailiff didn't lower his weapon. "Turn around and leave now." But the man only smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that sent a shiver through the room. Then, as if on cue, two more figures emerged from the shadows behind him, their faces obscured and their movements unnervingly synchronized. They carried weapons sharp, metallic tools that caught the dim light with menacing precision. "Your Honor," Nathan called out, his voice firm despite the panic building in his chest. "You need to evacuate this room. Now." The judge, visibly shaken, hesitated. "What is going on here? Who are these people?" Nathan didn't have time for explanations. "If you want to keep everyone here alive, clear the room." Before the judge could respond, the stranger raised a hand, signaling his companions to stop. His eyes locked on Nathan, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. "You don't understand, Sergeant," the man said, his tone eerily polite. "This isn't personal. Thor belongs to us. He always has." Nathan felt his anger rise, cutting through the fear. "He doesn't belong to anyone. He's my partner. My family." The man's smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. "You can hold on to that leash all you want, but the truth is simple. He's not yours to keep." Thor barked again, his voice a defiant roar that echoed through the room. It was enough to snap the crowd out of their daze. Spectators began rushing toward the exits, their fear boiling over into frantic movements. "Bailiffs," the judge yelled, "secure this room." But before they could act, the stranger raised his hand again, and this time, he wasn't signaling his companions. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness once more. In the chaos, Nathan heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy scraping across the floor, followed by a sharp, metallic clang. And then, Thor lunged. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing every sound but the chaos erupting around Nathan. Thor's leash jerked in his hands, the dog pulling with a force that felt impossible to contain. His barks were deafening, an urgent, furious alarm that only heightened the panic in the room. Somewhere to Nathan's left, chairs clattered as people scrambled toward the exits, their shouts blending into a cacophony of fear. Nathan's mind raced. Thor had never acted this way unless the threat was imminent and undeniable. But here, in a courtroom, it didn't make sense until now. The stranger wasn't bluffing. Nathan's gut told him this was no ordinary man, and whatever he wanted with Thor went far beyond a simple reassignment. This was something darker, something personal. The flickering lights returned, casting sporadic flashes across the room. In the intermittent glow, Nathan could see the stranger and his companions advancing slowly. Their movements were deliberate, calculated. The weapons they carried gleamed with a cruel efficiency, and the sight of them sent a chill racing down Nathan's spine. Thor lunged again, his growls turning primal. Nathan's grip faltered for a moment, but he tightened it with both hands. "Stay with me, Thor," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Sergeant Carter." It was Captain Laura Hayes, her voice sharp and commanding. She pushed her way through the crowd, her face a mixture of fear and determination. "What's going on? Who are these people?" Nathan didn't have answers, but he didn't need them to recognize the danger. "They're here for Thor," he said, his voice grim. "And they're not leaving without a fight?" Laura glanced toward the intruders, her jaw tightening. She'd been in combat long enough to read the situation for what it was. "We can't let them have him," she said firmly. "You know that, right?" Nathan nodded, his throat dry. "I know." The stranger stepped forward, his face illuminated by the sporadic flashes of light. His calm demeanor was unnerving, his every movement oozing control. He didn't speak, but his gaze locked on Nathan, a silent warning that said more than words ever could. Behind the stranger, his two companions began spreading out, their presence amplifying the unease in the room. One moved toward the exits, blocking any escape route, while the other lingered near the judge's bench, their weapon glinting ominously. "Your Honor," Laura yelled, turning to the judge. "You need to evacuate now. Get everyone out of here." The judge, pale and visibly shaken, nodded hurriedly. He motioned to the remaining bailiffs. "Clear the room, now." The bailiff scrambled to control the panicked crowd, ushering people toward the side exits. But the stranger's voice cut through the noise like a knife. "No one leaves." His tone was soft, almost conversational, but it carried an authority that froze everyone in place. The bailiffs hesitated, their instincts clashing with their fear. One of them raised his weapon, his hands trembling. "You don't want to do that," the stranger said smoothly, tilting his head. His smirk widened. "It won't end well for you." Nathan felt the weight of Thor against his leg. The dog's growls, a steady reminder of the escalating threat. He leaned closer, his voice low and urgent. "Thor, down. Stay with me." Thor obeyed, his body lowering slightly. But his focus on the stranger didn't waver. Nathan could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. Laura crouched beside Nathan, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "We need a plan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If these guys are after Thor, there's more to this than we're seeing." "What aren't they telling us?" Nathan shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm not letting them take him." Before Laura could respond, the stranger gestured subtly, and his companion near the judge's bench stepped forward, raising their weapon. "Let's make this simple," the stranger said, addressing the room. "Thor comes with us, and no one gets hurt." Nathan's anger flared. "You think I'll just hand him over?" he snapped, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The stranger chuckled softly, his eyes gleaming. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Sergeant Carter. The question is, do you?" The words hit Nathan like a blow. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, as if he knew more about Nathan and Thor than he should. Laura tensed beside him. "They're stalling," she whispered. "We need to act before they take control completely." Nathan nodded, his grip on Thor's leash tightening. "We need to figure out what they want and why." But there was no time for answers. The stranger clapped his hands once, a sharp sound that echoed through the room. His companions moved in unison, their weapons raised, and the tension in the courtroom snapped like a coiled spring. Thor barked fiercely, his body surging forward with explosive energy. Nathan held on with all his strength, his heart pounding as the room erupted into chaos once again. The air in the courtroom was electric, charged with an intensity that pressed down on everyone. Thor's barks were relentless now, sharp and ferocious, each sound like a hammer striking steel. Nathan's arms burned as he gripped the leash tighter, his body trembling under the strain. He could feel Thor's strength, his determination, and it mirrored his own. The stranger stepped closer, the measured cadence of his boots clicking against the floor. Each step felt like a countdown to something inevitable. He stopped a few feet away from Nathan, his smirk curling into something colder. "You've fought battles before, Sergeant," he said, his voice dripping with a maddening calm. "But this one? You can't win." Nathan's jaw clenched. "You're underestimating me," he shot back. "Thor isn't yours, and he never will be." The stranger tilted his head, studying Nathan like a predator sizing up prey. "You think this is about ownership? About some misplaced sense of loyalty?" He chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "Thor is more than you realize. And so are you." Nathan froze, the stranger's words slicing through him. What did he mean? What could they possibly want from Thor or him? Behind the stranger, his two companions moved into position, their presence like shadows looming over the room. The exits were blocked, the crowd huddled in silent fear, and the bailiff stood frozen, unsure of how to regain control. Laura's voice broke through the tension, sharp and defiant. "If you know who he is, then you know what he's capable of," she said, stepping forward to stand beside Nathan. "And if you think we'll just roll over, you've made a serious mistake." The stranger's eyes flicked to her, his smirk unwavering. "Ah, the loyal soldier, always ready to fight for a lost cause." Nathan leaned forward in his wheelchair, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't know what you've walked into. Thor isn't just my partner, he's my family. And we don't back down, Thor barked again, his growls reverberating through the courtroom. The stranger's companions shifted, their weapons raised slightly, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, without warning, Thor lunged. The leash snapped taut as Nathan struggled to hold him back, but it wasn't a wild attack. Thor's movements were precise, calculated, his focus locked on the stranger. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp, and Nathan knew what that meant. Thor had identified the threat. The stranger raised his hand, signaling his companions to stop. His smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by something colder, more calculating. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, his voice quieter but no less dangerous. "This isn't about you. It's about what Thor can do, what he can uncover." Nathan's breath hitched. Uncover? The word hung in his mind, a riddle with no answer. Laura stepped closer, her voice low but fierce. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends here." The stranger's gaze hardened. "You think so?" He glanced down at Thor, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over, Sergeant. Not by a long shot." And with that, the lights flickered violently again, plunging the room into temporary darkness. When they came back, the stranger and his companions were gone, but the sense of danger remained, thick and suffocating. Nathan looked down at Thor, who stood by his side, his body still coiled with tension. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. And Nathan knew one thing for sure. They had only seen the beginning. The courtroom buzzed with the heavy silence of fear, as though the air itself had thickened. Thor stood alert, his growls a low rumble that vibrated through the floor. Nathan's hands gripped the sides of his wheelchair, his knuckles white with tension. The stranger's parting words echoed in his mind. "This isn't over, Sergeant." Not by a long shot. Nathan's instincts screamed that they were far from safe. He had spent years trusting his gut, and it had never let him down. His eyes scanned the room, the faces of the scattered crowd pale with confusion and terror. The judge, visibly shaken, shuffled papers on his bench as though busywork could make sense of what had just unfolded. Laura crouched beside Nathan, her voice low but urgent. "This isn't a retreat. They're regrouping. You know that, right?" Nathan nodded. "They'll be back. And next time, they won't just leave when the lights come on." "Then we have to get everyone out of here," Laura said, glancing toward the exits. "You know as well as I do this isn't about Thor. It's about something bigger." Nathan's jaw tightened. Thor is the key to whatever they're after. They think they can use him. Laura placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "But they don't understand what they're up against." "We do." Before Nathan could respond, Thor tensed, his ears snapping forward. His growls deepened, sharp and guttural, sending a chill through the room. Something was happening. Nathan's eyes darted to the far end of the courtroom, where the heavy wooden doors stood ominously shut. "Thor," he whispered, his voice strained. "What do you see?" The dog's body shifted slightly, his gaze locked on the doors. And then Nathan felt it, a faint vibration through the wheels of his chair. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. "Something's coming," Nathan muttered, his stomach knotting. The sound came next, a faint, metallic scrape, like nails dragged against steel. It echoed faintly, growing louder with each passing second. The crowd stilled, their panic temporarily replaced by a collective dread. Laura stood, her hand on her sidearm. "We need to move. Now." The doors burst open. Two figures stormed in, their movements sharp and deliberate. They wore tactical gear, their faces obscured by helmets and masks. One held a device emitting a faint, pulsing blue light, a signal, or perhaps something worse. Nathan's heart pounded as he turned to Laura. "Do you recognize that gear?" She shook her head, her expression grim. "It's not standard military. Whoever they are, they're well equipped." The taller of the two figures pointed directly at Thor. "Surrender the dog," he commanded, his voice distorted through the helmet. It was calm, robotic, and chilling. Nathan wheeled himself forward, placing himself squarely between Thor and the intruders. "You're going to have to go through me?" The shorter figure raised a weapon, a sleek, compact device that emitted a faint hum, unlike anything Nathan had seen before. "Don't make this difficult," the figure warned. Nathan's voice rose, clear and unshakable. "You think you can walk in here, threaten us and take him? You don't understand what Thor is capable of, or what we are." The taller figure tilted his head, almost amused. "We know exactly what he's capable of. That's why we're here." Thor barked, sharp and ferocious, cutting through the tension like a blade. The taller figure motioned to his partner, who stepped forward, the humming weapon aimed directly at Nathan. Before they could act, a sudden, deafening noise shattered the air. A crackling pop followed by a blinding flash. The entire room seemed to vibrate, and Nathan felt Thor's leash jerk as the dog sprang into action. In the chaos, Nathan caught glimpses of Thor, a blur of movement as he charged at the intruders. His growls turned to snarls, a force of nature no training could replicate. The shorter figure stumbled, their weapon knocked loose, and Thor was on them, his powerful jaws clamping down on their arm. "Thor, heal!" Nathan shouted, but his voice was almost drowned out by the pandemonium. Laura moved swiftly, her sidearm drawn. She aimed at the taller figure, who had stepped back, reaching for something on his belt. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice sharp. But the figure didn't freeze. Instead, he pressed a button, and a high-pitched whine filled the air. Nathan's chest tightened as he recognized the sound. Whatever they'd activated, it wasn't just a weapon. It was something far worse. "Thor, back!" Nathan yelled, his voice breaking with desperation. Thor hesitated, his instincts kicking in. He released his grip on the intruder and darted back to Nathan's side, his body still bristling with energy. The taller figure spoke, his voice calm but menacing. "You can't stop this, Sergeant. Thor belongs to us. And no matter where you go, we'll find him." Nathan's pulse thundered as he met the man's gaze. "Not if we find you first." And for the first time, the stranger hesitated. The air buzzed with an unnatural hum as the taller figure's device continued to emit its high-pitched whine. Nathan felt Thor press against his leg, the dog's body tense and coiled like a spring. Laura stepped closer, her weapon still trained on the intruder, her voice sharp and commanding. "Turn it off," she shouted. "Now!" The figure hesitated, their confidence flickering as they glanced between Thor, Laura, and Nathan. "You don't understand what's at stake," the man said, his voice distorted by his helmet. "This isn't about you, it's about what that dog represents." Nathan's anger boiled over, his voice cutting through the chaos like steel. "Thor isn't just a tool you can use. He's saved lives, mine included. And he's not going anywhere with you." The shorter figure staggered to their feet, their arm hanging limp where Thor had bitten. They retrieved their weapon, but it was clear they were losing control of the situation. "You've already lost," Nathan said, his tone low and resolute. "You underestimated us. Thor's more than you'll ever understand, and you'll never be able to break the bond we have." The taller figure seemed to weigh his options, the hum of the device still growing louder. The room felt like it was vibrating, the tension threatening to snap at any moment. Laura stepped forward, her aim steady, her voice like a blade. "Whatever that thing is, shut it down. Now." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a reluctant motion, the taller figure reached for the device and pressed a button. The high-pitched sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. "Good choice," Laura said, her eyes narrowing. But the intruder wasn't finished. "You think this ends here?" the taller figure said, his voice calm despite the failure of their plan. "You have no idea what's coming." Before Nathan could respond, the man threw a small cylindrical object to the floor. Smoke erupted instantly, a thick cloud that consumed the room. The figures vanished into the haze, their silhouettes disappearing like ghosts. "Stay down," Laura yelled, covering her mouth and motioning for Nathan to do the same. Thor growled low, his instincts keeping him grounded as the smoke began to dissipate. When the air cleared, the intruders were gone. Only the faint scent of burned ozone and the overturned courtroom furniture remained as evidence of their presence. Nathan exhaled heavily, his chest heaving. Thor sat beside him, his head low but his eyes sharp, scanning the room for any lingering threats. Laura lowered her weapon, her jaw tight. "They'll be back," she said grimly. Nathan nodded, his hand resting on Thor's head. "I know. But next time, we'll be ready." Thor leaned into Nathan's touch, his body relaxing for the first time since the chaos began. Whatever had just happened was only the beginning, but Nathan knew one thing with certainty. Thor wasn't just a dog. He was his partner. And together, they could face whatever came next. The courtroom was eerily silent, the chaos of moments ago replaced by a heavy stillness. Chairs were overturned, papers scattered across the floor, and the faint haze of smoke lingered in the air. Most of the spectators had fled, and those who remained sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. Nathan leaned back in his wheelchair, his hand still resting on Thor's head. The dog's breathing was steady now, though his sharp eyes darted around the room, ready to spring into action if needed. Nathan could feel the warmth of Thor's loyalty through the leash, a reminder that, no matter what happened, they were in this together. Laura crouched beside him, her sidearm still in her hand but lowered. "You okay?" she asked, her voice quieter now, touched with concern. Nathan nodded, though his body felt heavy with exhaustion. "We're fine," he said, glancing down at Thor. Thanks to him, the judge, who had remained seated through the ordeal, stood slowly, gripping the edge of his bench as though it were the only thing holding him upright. He cleared his throat, but his voice trembled when he spoke. "Mr. Carter, what just happened here? Who were those people?" Nathan exhaled deeply, searching for the right words. "They were after Thor," he said simply. "They think they can use him, turn him into some kind of weapon or tool. But they're wrong." The judge rubbed his temples, his stern demeanor cracked under the weight of the situation. "This isn't just a case of custody anymore," he said. "This is a matter of security. For everyone." Laura straightened, holstering her weapon. "He's right. Whoever they are, they're not going to stop. And we can't wait for them to make the next move." Nathan's grip on Thor's leash tightened. They want to use Thor because they know how special he is. But they don't understand what makes him special. It's not just his training or his instincts, it's his loyalty. His heart. He paused, his voice firm. And that's something they'll never be able to take. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we make sure they can't even try." The judge looked between them, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "What do you propose? This isn't just a legal issue anymore." Nathan met his gaze, his voice steady. "Thor stays with me. That's non-negotiable. But I'll work with whoever I need to, military, law enforcement, anyone, to ensure he's protected. And I won't let them come after him again." The judge nodded slowly. "I'll support that. But you understand this will require more than just a ruling. You'll need to be vigilant." Nathan's lips pressed into a thin line. "Vigilance is something I've got plenty of experience with." The room fell silent again as everyone processed the gravity of the situation. Laura turned to Nathan, her brow furrowed. "Do you think they'll actually stop? Or was this just the beginning?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "They'll come back. But we'll be ready. I won't let them win." Thor nuzzled Nathan's hand, his eyes filled with unwavering trust. Nathan looked down at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You've saved me more times than I can count, buddy. Now it's my turn." Laura gave him a small nod. "Whatever happens, you're not facing it alone. We've got your back." The judge cleared his throat again, his voice firmer now. "For now, this court is adjourned. I'll file the ruling that Thor remains under your care, Sergeant Carter." and I'll personally ensure the authorities are alerted to what happened here." Nathan nodded in gratitude, his chest tightening with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the judge stepped down, the remaining spectators began to shuffle out, their voices hushed and their expressions wary. The courtroom, once filled with tension and fear, slowly began to feel like just a room again. Nathan exhaled and turned to Laura. "We've got work to do," he said simply. She nodded. "Yeah, we do. But first, let's get you and Thor somewhere safe." Nathan glanced down at Thor, who sat obediently at his side, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Despite everything that had happened, Thor radiated a calm confidence, as if to say, "We're okay. We've got this." For the first time in a long while, Nathan felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't face them alone. Thor was more than just a dog. He was a protector, a partner, and a reminder of what it meant to keep fighting, no matter the odds. As they left the courtroom together, the weight of the battle still lingered, but Nathan felt lighter. The bond between him and Thor had been tested, and it had proven unbreakable. Whatever came next, they were ready. Nathan sat on the edge of his modest home's porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Thor lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his watchful eyes still scanning the surroundings. It was their first moment of quiet since the events at the courthouse, and the calm felt fragile, as though the world might shatter it at any moment. Laura emerged from the house, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She handed one to Nathan, her expression soft but serious. "You need to sleep at some point," she said, sitting beside him. Nathan took the mug, the warmth spreading through his hands. "Sleep doesn't come easy these days," he admitted, his gaze fixed on Thor. "Not after what happened." Laura followed his line of sight. "He's always on duty, isn't he?" she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Even when things are quiet." Nathan nodded. "That's Thor. Always watching. Always ready." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "They wanted to take him, Laura. Like he's just a thing. A tool to be used. But they didn't," Laura reminded him. "And they won't. Not while you're here." Nathan exhaled, his grip on the mug tightening. "I've been through wars, seen things I wouldn't wish on anyone. But the thought of losing him," he shook his head, his voice trailing off. "You didn't lose him," Laura said firmly. "And you won't. Not as long as you keep fighting." Nathan looked at her, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thanks. For everything. I couldn't have handled this alone." "You don't have to," she said. "Thor's not the only one who's got your back." The two sat in companionable silence, the weight of the past few days slowly easing under the quiet of the evening. Nathan sipped his drink, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. The strangers had disappeared, but the threat they represented was far from gone. Still, he felt a spark of determination he hadn't felt in years. Thor shifted, his ears perking up at a distant sound. Nathan glanced down, smiling softly. "Relax, buddy," he said, his voice steady. "We're safe. For now." Thor's tail wagged slightly, a rare moment of calm from the dog who had saved Nathan's life more times than he could count. Nathan reached down, running his hand along Thor's fur, his voice quiet but resolute. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Like we always do." The sun slipped fully beneath the horizon, leaving the world bathed in the soft glow of twilight. For the first time in a long while, Nathan allowed himself to feel something other than fear or anger. He felt hope, not just for himself, but for the bond he shared with Thor, a bond no one could break, no matter how hard they tried. As the night settled in, Nathan leaned back in his chair, Thor resting peacefully at his side. The fight wasn't over, but tonight they had won, and that was enough.